welcome to our Westside Church podcast. Our new title for this new year is Thrive, and that's exactly what we're hoping to accomplish with this podcast, is helping you thrive through life's difficulties. The title of today's podcast is What Do You Do When Life Smacks You in the Face? That's a doozy of a question, and I have Pastor Craig joining me. He's also my husband, so this is a question I would like answered. What do you do when life smacks you in the face?
Well, one of the things I would maybe share with you, with people, is not to be surprised, because it happens to everybody. You know, no matter how you're mature you might be spiritually, you could look at characters in the Bible. They all deal with situations like that, just, unjust. And one of the things I really have stated recently really is stuck in my mind. I know it's a great truth, is this: the higher level of spiritual leadership you are called to, the greater the resistance the enemy will bring against you. And you shouldn't be surprised, because that's the world we live in. In Ephesians 6, it says, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against the principalities and powers of this dark world. And so we're not surprised that there's an enemy that doesn't want that to happen. I want to sit there and think for a moment how we're going to respond, and choosing to respond like Jesus. Jesus is always the hero in our lives, in the Bible, in everything. And so there's the response of Jesus as he lived this life. How did he face it? In full obedience and trust in his Father. That's where we want to be. We want to trust it and respond like him. He's our ultimate example. There's a character in the Bible. We went through a story in a series in the book of Ruth as a church. And there's a character there, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, and she responded with bitterness. And that's not right. And we can all relate to that, because I imagine, like me, we've gotten bitter over something. When life smacks you in the face, you think, oh, this isn't fair. What's the problem? And there are a couple levels I want us to think about when we're looking at this. One is, sometimes we suffer because we disobey God and there's a consequence. And what we're going to talk about today is more of when I'm even living for God and I get smacked in the face. Like, what do I do about that? And sometimes it's circumstances in life, and sometimes it's people. And some of the situations we're going to look at today are when people come against you when you are truly trying to follow God. So those are just perspectives I want to begin with as we head into this topic.
All right, so you, as one of our godly leaders, our senior pastor here, my husband, you already hit on what the Bible has said, what Jesus has said. What are some concrete biblical examples that you can give to help us when we feel beaten down by the world or by an opponent?
Well, there are so many. Basically, like I said, every character in the Bible, New Testament, Old Testament, they dealt with these things. And I want to begin here with a guy named Daniel. Daniel was a man who was in exile, far from home. He had to serve kings who didn't follow God, and he did so very faithfully, and yet kept his faith. He really lived for God in a really difficult spot, not ideal. And because he followed God, he was blessed by God, even in that difficult situation. And people got jealous of him. Other leaders saw that he followed God, and they were trying to trip him up because they wanted him out of the way. They wanted the platform Daniel had. They wanted the position Daniel had. And so they came up with this deceitful plan. Go ahead, trick the king, have him say everybody has to bow down to the king only, because they knew Daniel would only bow down to his God. So sure enough, that's what happens. Daniel bows down only to his God. And these people, these men, this is what it says here in Daniel 6, verse 11. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel petitioning and imploring his God. In other words, praying to God, disobeying the edict of the king. So they approached the king and asked about the edict, saying, you need to put him in the lion's den. So he gets put in the lion's den. And normally what's going to happen? You're going to be eaten and killed.
Yeah, that's not a good situation to be in.
But God protected him with an angel. And here's a biblical example where life smacks him in the face. It's unjust, it's unfair. What does he do? He trusts God. That's what we're called to do. Here's another example, a guy named Elijah, great prophet of God of the Old Testament. He's considered like the prophet of the Old Testament. And he stands for God and defeats the prophets of Baal, false god. And the people in charge in that day were King Ahab, really wicked king, and Queen Jezebel, who I think was probably even worse than him.
Well, wicked wives.
Like, don't name your kid Jezebel. Just
Yeah,
my suggestion.
not a good name either.
And so he defeats them, this great work of God. I mean, he goes, he builds an altar, prays for God to bring down fire from heaven to show a sign that he's the one true God. God does that. And so you're thinking, Elijah, dude, this is a man of God, and he's had this victory. He's going to just trust God. But Jezebel's not having that. Listen to what Jezebel says in 1 Kings 19. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, may the gods punish me and do so severely if I don't make your life like the life of one of them by this time tomorrow. In other words, you're going to die. Can you imagine that for a moment? And how discouraging that was. It was challenging. He was defeated. God still encouraged him. God still used him. But here's another example of he does what God wants. I mean, the great prophet of God. Finally, I'll use this example again from the Old Testament. I know I could go throughout the whole Bible, talk about so many characters, but we don't have the time for that. And there's a woman named Queen Esther, a young, beautiful woman, again in exile, and ends up marrying this king. This king, her husband, not a godly man, not one who follows the one true God. And because of Haman, one of the people that is in power underneath the king, his name's Haman, he hated Mordecai, who is the stepfather of Queen Esther, and decides, hey, I want to have all the Jews killed. Imagine being put in that situation. And so Queen Esther willingly has the people fast and pray and goes to her husband, the king. If he doesn't extend the scepter, she dies. If Haman's edict continues, they die. And all she's trying to do is what God wants. Eventually, God does give them favor, gives her victory. But again, she's following God. It's nothing she did. Things come against them. And when that happens, how do we respond? I believe one of those things that we need to understand is all of these characters in the Bible, you can look Old, New Testament, in the greatest struggles they have, the greatest injustice, what we tend to see is the greatest miracle of God coming through. Right?
Yeah.
God delivered Daniel. God delivered Elijah. God delivered Queen Esther. And ultimately, God rose Jesus from the dead. And so it's an act of faith that we see when life smacks you in the face, to have faith and trust my God's still good, even though maybe right now in this moment in my life, it's not that easy.
Yeah. Hard to do. Hard to do.
Yeah.
Appreciate those biblical giants that you shared. But what about everyday people like me who look at the Bible and say, I believe that. I believe God came through for Daniel. Yeah. It's obvious. And Elijah, he was an amazing prophet, but I'm not. Can you give some, I'm not. Can you give some everyday life examples of what you're talking about so that we can try to apply it to our lives? The Bible is awesome. It's supreme, but do you have any?
like you're saying, someone like you getting stuck being married to somebody like me, like something like that?
Yeah.
In seriousness, like when I look at the Bible, I imagine, honey, you feel this way, and most of us might. I can't relate fully to all that they're going through because I've never been through those extremes. I just haven't. Some people may be closer. I probably won't ever. But they're encouraging because even in those extremes, God comes through. In everyday life, as we're living for God, and specifically I want to focus on this, that when we're trying to live for God and someone comes against us, circumstances, people you think love you, sometimes they're like Queen Jezebel, enemies, right? Yeah. And I would, like, when you go try to share the gospel with a friend, they just make fun of you. That can be really discouraging, right? Something that I've not gone through this, by God's grace, getting to marry a godly woman like yourself. You love the Lord. But not everyone does. And as a pastor shepherding people that maybe there's someone trying to live for God and their spouse isn't. That's a hard spot. Sometimes the spouse gets resentful. Yeah. And trying to live for Jesus in that moment. And sometimes that I think of when I was, I dealt with a guy that I'd invited them to church, and he just came against me. He was mad. And then his wife was interested, and so he was irritated with me, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, that's really, really minor compared to the biblical examples. There are times when you're maybe at work and you're trying to do what's right and you don't have a godly boss and they want you to compromise, right? And it may cost you a promotion. You may lose your job or get in trouble because you're not willing to compromise. I mean, those things happen with real people. I deal with them I've not had to deal with that, but people have. And like for me, I've had trying to live for God, and sometimes life may be going your way, and it's not the same level of Daniel or others, but where people get jealous or they want that platform. And so they literally attack or say things that aren't even true. And when that happens, it's learning to just trust God with it. And there are people going through a whole lot worse things than those. Those are just a few examples of when we're trying to live for God and, things or people, people come against you. Sometimes it's you're trying to live for God and your parents aren't for it. That's hard. I've had that where people come to Jesus and their parents don't, and their parents don't want them living for Jesus. That's hard to be faithful. I've not been in that situation, but as a pastor trying to deal with people who are. And so whether that's at work, maybe it's at school, as a young person or in college, and it's not easy for people to say, like I've had people say this to me, I imagine some students may deal with, like, you believe that stuff?
Yeah.
Right?
Like it's some sort of mythical.
I imagine you've been there in life, in school, or wherever. So those are just some everyday life examples that we face. And there are other harder things in life that you might go through. You get that news from the doctor. You get, you lose your job, or all of a sudden a catastrophe happens financially, or you have a wayward child. You have these things going on in your life, and you're simply trying to live for God. How do you handle that? So those are just some examples.
I appreciate that, and I hope that our listeners do too. I was thinking, we do live in a broken, messed up world with people that don't always see eye to eye, like you were saying. Mm-hmm. So how do you keep a healthy perspective? Especially if you have people under the same roof. I'm so thankful that you and I are on the same page spiritually. Mm-hmm. But like you had mentioned, what if you're not dealing with someone who understands spiritual things or spiritual matters?
Yeah, you may be dealing with siblings, parents, spouse, whatever. I mean, there are people who deal with that. That's not easy. And I would keep a healthy perspective in the sense that, remember, God's always the hero, we're not. And so there should be a humility to know that, I'm not always living rightly before God. And we think of Jesus as the perfect one. And, on the cross, he said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. And having that heart for people, even if they really hurt you badly. And trying to imagine a Daniel, an Elijah, Queen Esther, those people going through hard things, total injustice, life smacking them in the face while they're trying to live for God. I'm not saying it's easy. As a church, we're going through this series in Nehemiah. Right. If you've never read Nehemiah, I really encourage you to read it. And as we're going through there, Nehemiah is this guy in the 5th century, an Israelite, called by God to go back as he's serving the king as cupbearer, Artaxerxes, and he's coming back to Jerusalem to rebuild the walls. And as he's doing so, he faces this Sanballat and Tobiah, these guys that they just don't want him to succeed, and he doesn't want the people to succeed, and they're coming against him, eventually try to have him killed. And to know that we're not always in line with God, that we need to have a humble heart. God's the hero, we're not. That's important. To be discerning, humble, prayerful, not self-righteous, knowing, as a follower of Jesus, I've been forgiven of everything I've done wrong, and I'm no more deserving of that than someone who might hurt me. I just think that's a really important, healthy perspective to have. That makes sense?
Oh, yeah, for sure. We're not perfect, but we try to point people to Jesus, who is the perfect one.
Yes.
So I guess in summary, just trying to wrap this whole concept of thriving, can you show us how we can thrive no matter what? Some nuggets, some wisdom that we can just take with us?
Well, I want to go back to just a healthy perspective. And I want to see here that remembering in humility, we're not battling people. Like Ephesians 6, which I've already quoted, for we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against the principalities and powers of this dark world. And just to remember that. People aren't the enemy, right? Your family member's not the enemy, your neighbor, whomever it is, they're not the real enemy. So keeping that in perspective. Another is having a perspective that you're to be an instrument of God in the situation. And I love in 1 Corinthians 7, we're blessed to not be there, but you go back to what Paul's writing to the church in Corinth in the first century, is people are coming to Christ. Sometimes their spouse hasn't done that. They've not come to Christ. So you have a husband with a wife who's not living for Jesus, or a wife with a husband not living for Jesus. And Paul's giving them instructions. Some of them are saying, hey, let me divorce my spouse and go marry someone who has the faith I have. And Paul's saying, I don't want you to do that. Yeah. Listen to what he says. I love this. He says this in 1 Corinthians 7. How do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband, or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? In other words, he's saying, be Jesus to them to lead them to Christ. That you are in that situation. Not easy. Right. Really hard. And try to be Jesus to them. Try to be an instrument in the shining light of Jesus in your life. And thinking to yourself, how can I be a blessing? And I love what Acts 20:35. Paul is sharing how he's living a hard life. He's sacrificing a lot for others. And he's going off and making tents, sharing the gospel, getting beaten, put in prison, eventually loses his life. But this is what he says. It says this in verse 35 of Acts 20. In everything I did, I showed you that by this kind of hard work, we must help the weak, remembering the words the Lord Jesus himself said, it is more blessed to give than to receive. And to trust that my God is going to come through for me as I sacrifice, as I do for others, even those who come against me, that I can trust that my God, when he says it's more blessed to give than to receive, the blessed life is obeying God. It is sacrificing for others. And just an encouragement to shrink back when we're faced with these kind of challenges, when life smacks us in the face. Not to shrink back, but to obey God and trust he's going to do something great through it.
Letting Christ shine through you, not your emotions, not the heat of the moment or that anger, like you said, because it's not the person, it's the spiritual battle that's going on around us. That's really insightful. Yeah. So again, this whole podcast is on thriving, and we're facing opposition, within our lives and around us, in the world, universal. How can we thrive no matter what?
I would, this is the thought I would want to leave with people, this kind of perspective. And I love this. We're going to look here in a moment at James chapter 1. That I had a leader recently say that when we're going through testing, trials, life smacks us in the face, to literally embrace it. To embrace it and trust that my God is sovereign. He's in total control. He loves me. And he's going to use this that I would be more like Jesus. He's going to use this to bless me and grow me. Like the greatest blessing is to be in a better relationship with God. That is the greatest blessing. Like oftentimes, even as followers of Jesus, I've walked with God a while. And as a follower of Jesus, sometimes I'm looking for ease, right? Comfort.
Yeah, you don't want to embrace
security.
Someone smacking you in the face.
You don't, but allowing it to refine you and grow you and trusting that's what God says he's doing. This is what it says in James 1. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. In other words, consider it joy. Right? You think about, this is James, the brother of Jesus. He ends up being killed for his faith, history tells us. And he's writing to a church that's being persecuted and is suffering. Right? This isn't, he's not in an ideal situation. The followers of Jesus aren't. And he's telling them, ones who are suffering persecution, greater than I imagine that we face, right?
For sure.
In our world. And he's saying, consider it joy, pure joy. When you're facing, because it's developing perseverance, and we need to persevere. The most mature, the most used by God are those who persevere. They keep going. It's not a flying the, just one-time thing. It's a lifestyle of living for God. And that perseverance helps us to not lack anything, to be mature and to really know God and to be that godly example. That's the blessed life. And so when we're smacked in the face, not responding with bitterness like Naomi, but responding with obedience like Jesus. He's our ultimate example and hero. And he persevered till death. And that we just have that perspective that I'm going to embrace this, I'm going to trust God, I'm going to obey him, and I'm going to watch him work. And that's how we thrive. We can thrive through really hard times, not because all of a sudden, and sometimes he does, he just gives me an answer to prayer and takes me out of the situation. A lot of times he doesn't.
Yeah.
Right? What did he do? He saw Elijah through it. He saw Queen Esther through it. He saw Daniel through it. And he'll see us through it.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your wisdom. We're so glad that you were tuned in with us today. We hope that you continue to check back with us and learn more about how you can thrive and live for God in this really hard, smack in the face kind of life. So thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.